This is our Vineyard Climate Action webinar. We will be hosting another one next week focused on the winery side. So if you'd like to join us, that'll be next Tuesday, May 20th at 10 a.m. So the idea for this next hour or so is to, I'm going to talk a little bit about our Climate Smart project and around why climate action is important before I hand it over to Dr. Lauren Parker from UC Merced, who is going to walk us through some of the latest science on climate change in California viticulture and some of the work that she has been doing with her team. And then after that, we're going to get to dive into the benefits of biochar with Mayo Ryan from Sitos Group. And then at the very end, I will wrap it up by showing our Climate Action Toolkit, and we'll be able to have some more questions and answers then. We can take questions at the end of each of the speakers as well. So if you'd like to just put any questions into the Q&A, that would be great. And then Thane on the CSWA team will also help us address some of the questions. So the Climate Smart wine growing project that the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance has been leading for the past 2.5 years has been a really fun project where we got to work closely with the California Climate Hub, which Lauren was a member of for a long time, but just recently moved over to UC Merced. But through that, did a science literature review on the impacts of climate change and adaptation strategies. And so that's some of what she'll be talking about later. Through this project, we also hosted a number of roundtables with wine growers and some working groups to really look at, what are the needs of the California wine industry when it comes to climate change, and what are kind of the tools and resources that would be most helpful to you all. And these working groups also really helped with our Climate Action Toolkit that I'll talk about in a bit later. And that toolkit is really one of the key deliverables from this project, where we have practices, tools, case studies, et cetera, all around trying to help vineyards and wineries increase their mitigation and adaptation to climate change. We're hosting a number of workshops and webinars, including this one, then also did some communications as well around kind of what is happening within the California wine industry around climate action, both for wine growers, but also for trade and consumers, that I'll touch on at the very end. So just so you know, some of our project partners on this project, we worked closely with resource conservation districts, with a number of representatives from the different sustainability programs within California, a number of consultants, of course, with the California Climate Hub. So it's been a really great collaborative effort to get to this point. And then, as I mentioned, we have a climate action working group. So I just wanted to share some of the names of the people who've really dedicated a lot of their time and expertise into this project and into the development of the Climate Action Toolkit. So people who really represent vineyards and wineries all over the state and different sizes as well. So I just wanted to share a little bit about some background on key concepts in climate action, just to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page. And feels a little funny, but I like to start with what is climate change in general as a reminder, really, that we're talking about long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns, not just, day-to-day changes, of course, and that these are all really caused by greenhouse gas emissions, primarily carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide for vineyards and wineries that trap the sun's heat. And then when we're looking at climate change, there's really two main pathways for addressing it. One is through mitigation and one is through adaptation. So mitigation is really referring to any of the practices that help to reduce the impacts of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and then also actually removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere through carbon sequestration or other ways. Adaptation, we're really referring to what are the practices that help us adjust to both the current impacts of climate change and future impacts as well. And then you're probably hearing a lot more around climate smart wine growing, but this is really just a way to describe the practices for vineyards and wineries that help do both of those things, that help mitigate climate change impacts and also build resiliency through adaptation. This nice little diagram really helps to show that there are a lot of sustainable wine growing practices that many of you will be familiar with that fall within the climate smart practices kind of umbrella. And then also in the middle of this graph shows that there are a lot of things that you all are doing in your vineyards that actually both help to mitigate climate change and help you adapt. And that's really a lot around soil health, animal integration, enhancing biodiversity, water efficiency. All of these things are good to be focused on for many reasons, sustainability and for climate action. To dig just a little bit deeper into the mitigation side, the primary vineyard greenhouse gas emissions are nitrous oxide from nitrogen fertilizers, and then of course, carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels for electricity and for vehicles. And then so some of the, vineyard practices that help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions really focus on optimizing nitrogen use as much as possible and reducing tractor passes and reducing fuel use, looking at your energy efficiency and what can you do, especially with your irrigation systems, to make them as efficient as possible, and then using renewable energy and alternative fuels. On the sequestration side, for mitigation, carbon sequestration first is the capture and long-term storage of CO2 in both plant materials and also in the soils. And so because of that, there's a lot of ways in the vineyard to increase carbon sequestration. So increasing soil organic matter through compost, cover crops, mulch, biochar, which we'll hear about shortly, reducing or eliminating tillage, reducing soil compaction and off-site soil loss. All of these help with soil carbon sequestration. And then, of course, increasing vegetation in and around the vineyard also helps with carbon sequestration in plant material. A carbon footprint is really referring to the amount of carbon or greenhouse gas emissions that come from all different parts of your operation. So from the vineyard, winery, and the supply chain, both upstream and downstream. But it's really useful to look at where are the hot spots and of the use of or the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions for your operation, and then how can you use that information to really prioritize practice improvements. And so this is the results of a study that Wine Institute did back in 2011, but still holds today when you compare it to other similar carbon footprint studies in the wine industry. It really just shows kind of, again, where are the hot spots, where are the areas that you might want to focus on within your own operation to really be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see always back to optimizing nitrogen use, but also reducing energy. And then of course, you can see on this little donut here that packaging is a really big part of a winery's carbon footprint. And so that's where you get into lightweight glass, alternative packaging, all of those things that are really important. And then wine distribution is another one that's a really big hotspot for wineries. And then two other terms to put out there is decarbonization, which is really one of the ultimate goals around climate action, is how do we decarbonize our operations? And this is referring to using carbon-free renewable energy for all of your energy needs as much as possible. And so you see this little diagram at the bottom that's part of the Climate Action Toolkit that really talks about, understanding your energy use through an audit, optimizing energy efficiency, electrifying equipment whenever that's possible, and then finally powering with renewable energy. So that's kind of the way we can get to decarbonization. And then net zero is a term you'll hear a lot, and that is referring to a state where the greenhouse gas emissions going into the atmosphere are balanced by what is coming out or being removed from the atmosphere. And so that's kind of the net zero. You'll hear a lot of net zero goals. Really briefly, I want to talk about kind of the case for climate action, and what Lauren covers is a much broader picture, or more detailed picture, I should say, of climate action for vineyards. Why climate action is needed. Really, we all know this, that we're experiencing direct impacts of climate change now. So that's more frequent and intense heat waves, greater year-to-year variability in rainfall, which increases the risk both for flooding from extreme rainfall events and also drought, and then changes in wildfire dynamics as well. Scientists expect that these impacts will continue to increase, and that they affirm that climate change does pose a significant threat to California agriculture, which is why we really need to be looking at our adaptation practices. It's agreed upon in the scientific community that cutting emissions is essential to avoid the very worst impacts of climate change. And so there has been this goal to really limit global temperature rise by 1.5 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels. We did actually reach this point in last year, 2024, although it's kind of gone back down, but still, we're on a trajectory right now of 5.7 degrees Celsius. So it's something that everyone, we know this, all industries need to be looking at how to decrease their greenhouse gas emissions. Because of this, governments, retailers, and increasingly wineries are setting greenhouse gas reduction targets and also net zero goals. California is one of those governments that has really strong greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. That's one of the topics we'll be talking about at a future webinar of some of the regulations that are coming out around some of California's goals. And then, of course, action from vineyards and wineries will be needed to really reduce emissions in line with both the climate science, that we know this is something we all need to be doing, but also because of this growing regulatory and marketplace expectations of retailers and California government and elsewhere, really having these greenhouse gas reduction targets and goals. And then finally, I just wanted to reiterate, sustainable wine growing really can be thought of as climate action. And so this is one, it's can be quite daunting to be talking about climate change and those, how much we need to reduce our emissions. But the wine community in California really is well positioned to address these challenges because of all of our sustainability work that's been happening for the past 20 plus years. And so, as I mentioned, sustainable wine growing practices really do help with adaptation and mitigation. And so while there's still a lot of work to be done, many of our growers and winemakers throughout the state are also really well versed in a lot of these practices. So that's the good news. And that's where I'll talk about the Climate Action Toolkit at the end to get into a little more details about helping people kind of set a plan and really increase their climate action work. With that, Lauren, I will turn it over to you, but do a quick introduction. And so, as I mentioned, we've had the pleasure of working with Lauren on this project for the past 2.5 years and are just so thankful for your work, Lauren. At the time of the project, she was an applied climate scientist and research program manager and program coordinator at the USDA California Climate Hub, and also a project scientist at UC Davis. Lauren is now the managing director of Secure Water Future and the academic coordinator at the Valley Institute for Sustainability, Technology, and Agriculture at UC Merced. So thank you so much for being here, Lauren. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. I see a couple people on the participant list that were part of some of this work. So I'll just say thank you now for your participation. I'm going to talk about managing U.S. vineyards for a changing climate, our current science-backed practices, and a vision for the future. And like Lisa mentioned, I'll get into a little bit of the kind of climate change trends that we expect to see, and then what that means a bit more specifically for California viticulture. It's really no secret to anybody on this call. California's climate makes it really suitable in a unique way for growing high quality wine. And I don't think I need to remind any of you of the impact of California's wine industry to local and state economies. The state grows about 80% of U.S. wine grapes. It's the fourth largest wine producing region in the world. It's about a $70 billion industry statewide, all told. But it's also no secret to anyone on this call that we're seeing challenges, both to California's agricultural production more broadly, but also its grape production. And this is really stemming, certainly there's some regulatory things to acknowledge, but I'm here to talk about how this stems from climate change. We have increased heat stress, reduced water security, pest and disease pressures, and other stressors that have all posed issues for California's wine grape sector in recent decades. And so, given the importance of viticulture to California and with future climate change in mind, we ask this broad question of, what will future climate change mean for California wine grapes? And then this logical follow-up question of, well, what can we do about it? So to hit that first question first, and before I get into what might happen, providing a little bit of background context just on observed climate changes in the state. Observed changes in temperature and precipitation patterns in recent decades have been towards warmer and drier conditions. And from a climate change perspective, we really expect these trends to continue. Of course, California has a lot of interannual variability in its precipitation particularly, but also in temperature. We expect that to continue, but that long-term trend we anticipate to be towards a warmer and drier future. We also expect things like extreme heat events to be on the rise. So this graph on the left is showing how in Paso Robles, a 3-day heat wave event that exceeds 103 degrees Fahrenheit. These events are expected to increase from about 1 to 3 events per year that's what we see now, to as many as 15 events per year by the end of the century, and that's under a lower emission scenario. Heat waves in general are also projected to be hotter and longer lasting. And so this is going to increase the risk of damage to grapes and increase the water demand for avoiding that damage. And the image on the right, this is what it looks like, right? You've got this impact of heat waves. This is what it can do to the berries, right? Turns them into raisins on the vine. In the future, warmer and drier conditions will reduce soil moisture and increase the risk for drought. Recent research shows that regardless of whether the future is modeled using low, medium, or even high emission scenarios, California is going to see drier conditions. Here, you're looking at drier conditions measured as a reduction in soil moisture. And then reduced water resources availability during drought, that in turn hinders the ability for growers to apply the increased water that's needed to cope with those hotter conditions. And, from a sort of meteorological perspective, hot drought can be a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. Soils dry out. Under high temperatures that can continue to raise temperatures, and you get into this bit of a vicious cycle. Research has also shown that climate change has increased the cumulative area burned by wildfire over what would have been burned in the absence of human-caused climate change. And this is really a function of climate change loading the dice. Those warmer and drier conditions load the dice for fire, and particularly larger and more intense fires. And in the future, I think we can expect that hotter and drier conditions will continue to raise the risk of fire, leading to, from a viticulture perspective, an increased risk of smoke taint in the grapes. And so, these are just a handful of ways that we might see climate change affecting viticulture as we move forward. One of the things that I want to focus in on in terms of what might happen with respect to climate change and California viticulture is really thinking about what will future climate mean for California wine grapes. And if we step back from, some of the potential effects and trends of climate looking forward, and we think about wine production, there were some questions around, okay, well, how might climate change affect wine grape phenology? And then how might it alter how exposed grapes are to climate stressors like extreme heat that can affect crop yield and quality? And then, of course, from a water perspective, require that increased water application to reduce potential impacts. And so as part of this work for the Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance, it was there were a few things that we got involved with at the USDA California Climate Hub, and one of those was this study on a variety-specific look at impacts to phenology and climate exposure for different varieties of California wine grapes. Now, previous studies have shown that wine grape phenology and how exposed grapes will be to potential negative impacts of climate change vary by location and variety. And we weren't able to analyze phenology and exposure changes for all varieties and all regions, but we selected 6 wine grape varieties and 12 California AVAs. So on the left here, you have your 6 varieties that we selected in the red boxes. And those were based on a combination of economic importance, cultivation acreage, tonnage, and the availability of variety-specific information available for determining variety-specific climate exposure. So we picked 3 red wine and 3 white wine varieties, Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, and Zinfandel, and then Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, and Sauvignon Blanc. And then we picked 12 AVAs. And here we were really thinking about climate. We tried to pick AVAs that were roughly similar in area, a selection that kind of provided a nice spread of coastal and inland climates, a good north to south gradient. And even though growing conditions obviously can vary within AVAs, given things like topography or aspect or other microclimate type features, these 12 AVAs, I think, offer a pretty good range of climate types so that even if a grower is based somewhere else, they can kind of identify, okay, well, this is the AVA with the climate conditions that most closely resemble the conditions of their own location. And so I think the results end up being somewhat useful. Um, so for both the phenology and climate exposure analyses, we looked at historical conditions using a gridded data set of observed climate variables. It's called GridMet, publicly available. And we looked at recent conditions over the 1991 to 2020 period. And then for the future, we used a data set called MACA, and that provides projected climate data for 20 global climate models, downscaled to a pretty local resolution, 4 kilometer spatial resolution. For the future, we chose to look at mid-century conditions, and we were looking at 2 potential future climate scenarios, a sort of low moderate emission scenario and then a higher emission scenario. For the climate exposure analysis, we took maximum and minimum temperature, precipitation, and reference evapotranspiration variables. And then for the phenology analysis, we used maximum and minimum temperatures to develop some phenology models. So I'm getting into some details now. Um, you know, wine grape development is really complex. But here, for the purposes of this research, we simplified it to 4 stages: budburst, flowering, veraison, and maturity, or harvest. And we developed models for each variety using climatic thresholds that were found in literature for reaching each of these development stages. And we built this phenology model for each of the 6 wine grape varieties. And so we were able to identify the timing, estimated timing on average of budburst, flowering, and veraison using growing degree day accumulation. And then we used biologically effective degree days. It's an alternative measure for crop development. We used that for harvest because we were not able to find growing degree day thresholds for all of our varieties in the literature. So as anyone on this call who maybe does or has done science, you do the best you can with what you've got. And for our climate exposure analysis, we look to the literature to identify a whole suite of agroclimate metrics that have been flagged as being important to viticulture. And then we calculated the change in those metrics between the current and future period. And I'm gonna, in the interest of time, kind of keep cranking, but we did a whole host of agroclimate metrics, again, that the literature said, hey, these are important, flag these. So just to take a look at some of our results, and again, all of this research is really to underscore, why it's important to consider climate change when you're thinking about future production of wine grapes in California. Things that we saw in terms of phenology modeling: chill takes longer to accumulate. Winters are warming up. Budburst, flowering, veraison, and maturity end up occurring earlier in the year, and that's because springs and summers are also warming up. So overall, even though chill takes longer, development ends up being faster, and harvest ends up coming earlier. But how much you see that change depends on variety, on location. And this graph here on the left is showing just Pinot Noir, but you can see the difference in the amount of change that you could expect just on location alone. I think one of the things that's worth noting is our hotter, if you will, AVAs like Madeira see a less advancement in later development stages than cooler AVAs. And this could be a function of, the nitty-gritty of our models. But nonetheless, I think it's also worth pointing out that each development phase from bud burst to veraison, shown here, sees a greater and greater change in timing, but then you see this amount of change reduced from maturity. And I just want, for anybody who's eagle eyes are noting that, I just want to say that I think this is a function of the fact that we had to use biologically effective degree days to model maturity timing. So again, I think if we were able to do this again using growing degree days, we might see some different amounts of change across our varieties in that development stage. That's for my scientists on the call. So we also see with our climate exposure results, we see warming speeds development, reductions in chill, lengthens the growing season and increases heat stress. All of these are, kind of no surprise. This is a graph showing a handful of changes between today and mid-century under a moderate emission scenario for a handful of these 14 agroclimate metrics, again, using Paso Robles as an example. We saw a big increase in growing degree days and a big decline in chill. We also see a real increase in the number of days over 35 Celsius, an additional 20 days per year of these potentially damaging hot days in Paso Robles. And then, of course, more extreme heat events. So we see all these changes. Now the question becomes, what can we do about it? To answer this question, we took a whole system approach and we considered soils and vineyard floor management, water and irrigation management, plant materials, genetic strategies, canopy management, technology and instrumentation-based approaches. And we sought to address what can we do within each part of the system to help improve the resilience for the system as a whole. And we brought together a suite of experts in climate smart agriculture and viticulture from university labs, USDA, cooperative extension, and industry. And we had a 2-day, really highly structured and facilitated workshop that guided participants through a series of facilitated sessions to identify and prioritize the strategies for adaptation that could address the most pressing climate stressors facing California viticulture, given what we know about observed changes and what we know about modeled climate projections. And I also just want to point out that part of the workshop included an industry panel, and we heard from folks in industry on their perspectives on climate change and their needs. And that conversation really highlighted, the need to focus on soils and genomics, irrigation, and technology as we push forward with research. And I think the challenge and, I think the solution that we could acknowledge in many ways is figuring out how to integrate across these research areas and how to integrate across information systems and across practices for this whole systems approach. So what were some of the management strategies that came out of this workshop? Soil health was a big one. Soil health and water resources management are closely coupled in agricultural systems. Our experts identified 3 key soil health practices that producers can adopt to improve the resilience of vineyards from a water perspective. The addition of soil amendments like compost, that can improve soil structure and soil water holding capacity. Reducing soil disturbance through minimizing tilling can also have long-term benefits for soil water holding capacity. Although it's worth noting that tillage has some short-term benefits and can, in the immediate term, improve water infiltration. Yet the disturbance to the soil ultimately disrupts soil structure. And so in the long term, you end up with reductions in soil health. And then on the bottom 2 images there, you see mustard on the left and winter rye on the right. And these were just 2 examples of some cover crops that can improve soil structure and soil porosity. So again, we're trying to improve soil water holding capacity vis-a-vis improving soil health broadly. Notably on these 2 cover crops, they can both be mowed in spring, so they don't end up competing with vines for water, if that's a concern. Focusing in on water more specifically, Soil moisture monitoring is, a key connection between soil-focused practices and water-focused practices. So soil moisture monitoring, through using multi-depth sensors, like you see in that top image, that's important for making irrigation scheduling decisions. New technologies and platforms like OpenET are making satellite-derived actual evapotranspiration data available to growers. And so knowing in near real time crop consumptive water use in conjunction with their data from soil moisture monitors and in vineyard weather stations, whatever else growers are using, I think it allows for an improvement in growers' ability to schedule irrigation and apply precise water amounts to meet crop water needs. And then the water efficiency that comes with precision irrigation certainly is critical as we move towards a warmer and drier future, and with potential regulations depending on where you are. Um, Rootstocks, I know I'm like running through this really fast. Rootstocks and cultivar selections were identified as important decision points for growers who may be replacing a vineyard block or planting a new vineyard. For example, some high vigor rootstocks have properties that might make them better able to access water in dry years. They can develop larger canopies that can provide some shade during heat events. Growers could also consider the disease resistance or salinity tolerance of different rootstocks as disease and pest pressures may continue to increase with climate change. At least that's what we expect. And then cultivars also are an important consideration when managing for climate change. If you think about what are potential cultivars relative to grape development and the sort of match between cultivar and climate is something worth considering. Managing vineyard canopies to reduce the effect of stressors like extreme heat exposure can maybe lessen the demand for water applied for evaporative cooling. And some research shows that transitioning away from the really common VSP trellis system to a more high wire system could improve resilience to extreme heat, provides canopy that shades the fruit. VSPs also often require more water than the high wire system, and transitioning between the two trellis systems can be done without replacing the vines, without replanting. So this is a relatively accessible canopy management option for climate adaptation. And then, our final piece of the system is a little bit within and yet external to the system, and that's technology. So it's suggested that producers invest in technology solutions where possible. And so this might mean investing time in learning how to apply freely available data from public weather stations or applications like OpenET, which again provides that satellite measurement of actual evapotranspiration. Technology investments might also come in the form of capital outlays to purchase advanced monitoring equipment. Maybe we'll have some future where autonomous robots are driving around vineyards all the time, monitoring vine water stress, right? And as technology evolves, it's worth keeping an eye on that evolution and where technologies have been proven, and capital is available, adopting those. So to kind of sum it up, right, there are a lot of things that many of you are already incorporating. And I think it's important to underscore that like the science backs up these practices, right? Using meteorological stations or CIMA stations and water meters for irrigation scheduling. And yes, currently maybe you're using traditional tractors, but maybe there's an opportunity to invest in a lower emissions tractor, right? Maybe you are incorporating solar panels on your vineyard or on the edges of your vineyard in some way. Monitoring your groundwater pumping, adopting cover crop approaches, soil amendments like compost, right? Things that improve soil health. So just acknowledging that a lot of growers across the state are already doing a number of these practices and adopting them more broadly or more of them. Yes, of course, there are challenges, and yet ultimately, the future of viticulture, I think in many ways, is really about expanding on practices that we already know are of benefit. Um, it doesn't necessarily have to be these massive wholesale overnight changes to the system, right? That's not really practical of an ask anyway. Over time, I think adopting wider application of things like compost, cover crops, doing that throughout the vineyard, adding flow meters or modernizing any irrigation technology where it's available, integrating livestock into the vineyard system, installing more photovoltaic panels, incorporating hedgerows, right? Adopting flood in winter to help restore aquifer health for the long term. And these are all things that, when expand that we know now that are science backed, that improve vineyard health, and as we expand them in the future, I think, provides greater resilience. I think, other things to consider include transitioning to rootstocks that can reduce smoke exposure in fire-prone areas through accelerating development and advancing the harvest dates. So maybe you harvest before it's, heavy fire season. Elevated sprawling canopy systems, again, provide that natural shade to reduce sunburn and dehydration, moderate canopy temperature. Um, on the technology side, when we think about the future, I think we anticipate that science and engineering, and I'm aware of my time, will advance to allow more autonomous remote sensing equipment, provide real-time measures of factors like vine health and crop water needs, advances in genomics, right? Maybe provide opportunities for the more rapid development of varieties that blend the resilience of crop wild relatives with the palatability of cultivars that are preferred by consumers. And then I guess, I think we see all of this opportunity for technology development, and some of it's already on the bleeding edge. But as a point of personal privilege, since I still have the floor, I'll say that while some technologies are currently in development, the timeline for advancements to a place where we really see proven technologies and a readiness for broad adoption, in my view, really depends on investments in research and tech R&D. And we're in a moment where support for publicly funded science is waning. So I think, as we all collectively think about what the vineyard of the future will look like, yeah, there's this vision, right? But we're not going to get there without a broad base of support and partnerships between research and industry. And so I'm just going to wrap it up by saying that those are the kinds of partnerships that I think CSWA aims to support. And so I just want to give a big, hat tip to them and their dedication to supporting the California wine industry. Um, yeah. And with that, I will end. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was really great. So I think one question was already kind of answered, and I know Thane was going to answer the other one. So we'll save any other questions till the end, and then go ahead and switch over to Mayo. So Mayo Ryan is the co-founder and CEO of Sitos Group. Um, and which is a company dedicated to repurposing organic materials to generate high quality biochar. Mayo has a deep background in agriculture, having farmed pistachios, wine grapes, and cotton, and has held several leadership positions with large agribusiness firms. I'll say briefly as a side note that those of you that know Steve McIntyre from Monterey Pacific and McIntyre Vineyards is the other co-founder of Sitos Group, and definitely known as one of the pioneers in sustainable viticulture in the Central Coast. So I'm really happy to have you here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thanks, Lisa. Thank you for having me today, especially the CSWA. We're delighted to be here. I'm Mayo Ryan. I'm the co-founder, along with Steve McIntyre, of the Sitos Group. Sito is another name for Demeter, the goddess of agriculture and the protector of food and grains. That's why we named the company after her. I'd like to do just a very, very brief overview, or very high-level overview, of biochar and perhaps its role in wine grapes and in vineyards. I'll start off by saying not a lot of people, it's really maybe 10 out of 100 might know biochar. And for the folks that have never heard that word before, I'll just kind of, again, do a high-level description of what it is. Biochar, this is a slide, oops, There we go. This is a slide from the UC Davis biochar database. It's a very complex carbon. It's made from pyrolysis. There are two ways to make biochar. One is gasification and one is pyrolysis. It's a very carbon-rich substance that is created when a biomass is passed through a chamber or a kiln. It can be a continuous chamber or a kiln, which are used mostly in vineyards now, ring kilns. And at high temperatures in a very low oxygen environment, but those temperatures say at 350 degrees centigrade to 750 degrees centigrade, raw material or biomass, when it's passed through that chamber, is converted, transformed actually, into a very high carbon substance, a really high, rich high carbon substance, depending on the process, up to 85 or 90% pure carbon. And that carbon lasts in soil for millennia, not just decades, but thousands, if not millions of years. As I said, the two methods of making pyrolysis, making biochar, are slow pyrolysis. This is a picture of our slow pyrolysis reactor, just taken a few weeks ago. This is a continuous reactor. The other is through gasification. And gasification's priority really is generation of energy, but that's where a lot of biochar comes from today. Biochar is a byproduct in gasifiers. In our process, this slow pyrolysis machine that's on the screen now, it is specifically designed to make very customizable biochar, and it's very adjustable in its operation. You might have heard of the terra preta soils. Biochar is not a new thing. It's 8,000 years old. Indigenous Amazonians were using biochar or form of biochar in soil, and some of the most healthy soils in the Amazon rainforest were the terra preta soils where biochar was used. It's a relatively new thing here. Now we think of biochar at this moment as kind of going through a biochar 2.0 stage. Biochar 1.0, maybe for the last 10 years, was a much smaller industry. Today, we're trying to scale biochar, make it the industry much more industrial and productive. So kind of in this biochar 2.0 stage. We think of biochar as kind of a coral reef for the soil. By itself, it really doesn't do much. It's a soil amendment more than anything, but it's a coral reef or a condominium complex for all of the beneficial bacteria, microbes, and the life that's teeming under the soil. And for the folks that don't know, in one handful of soil, there are more microorganisms than there are people on the planet. And through heavy tillage and the way we've been farming with the heavy use of synthetic sort of petroleum-based fertilizers, we've not treated that set of microbes very well, microorganisms. Biochar is the house for those. So it's a very fractal structure, and that scanning electron microscope photo on the right-hand side shows how fractal and porous it is. If you were to drill down into one of those holes, you would see the same sort of structure. And an odd thing is that one of the biochar quality components is that there's surface area. And in the size of a pencil eraser, 1 gram of biochar, there's a surface area of 500 square meters, up to 500 square meters, which is the size of a football field. So my brain has kind of a hard time getting itself around that. But that's really how biochar is in the soil. Why is biochar important? And Lisa and Lauren really did cover some of this, so I don't want to repeat this, but we think of soil degradation and desertification as I did until recently, as kind of something that occurs in the global south, not here, not in our backyard. But the UN Committee on Combating Climate Change put out this, or desertification, put out this map last year, and it's here. It's in our backyard. It's in the Salinas Valley, in the Napa Valley, in the San Joaquin and Sacramento valleys. It's something that's right here. And biochar is a really interesting way to start combating and reversing soil health and soil degradation. And the fun thing is, it's a really nice way of facilitating regenerative ag. Lauren talked about, and Lisa spoke about, some of the regenerative ag practices, whether those practices are right under the regenerative ag sort of flagpole or not. Biochar is a nice way of getting a lot of carbon in the soil. As I said, it's almost pure carbon. It also is a way to facilitate these 4 kind of new age economies. We have a lot of waste in California, 45 million tons a year, and about 12.5 million tons of that are agricultural byproduct waste. So the nice thing about biochar is that we're part of this. We can help solve the circular economy or develop the circular economy by repurposing that waste as feedstock for biochar. A lot of ag byproducts, almond shell, pistachio shell, wine grape must, would biosolids from human biosolids from wastewater treatment plants make very nice biochar. And when we get that biochar back into the soil, we create this really wonderful carbon loop. It's a nice thing to do. We can generate energy, electricity from the production of biochar, whether that's through a gasifier where it's its main priority, or through our slow pyrolysis machines by taking its heat, the heat produced through the process, and generating electricity using that heat. So we're part of the renewable energy economy. We're talking about its role in climate mitigation. We can remove, for every ton of biochar that we get into a vineyard or an orchard or a production setting, we can remove 2.5 tons, 2 to 2.5 tons of atmospheric carbon. And so that's a huge thing. And it's its role in soil health. So what does it do? Biochar, it's a very nice way of aggregating soil. It's an aggregant, so we can improve soil structure, which leads to drought mitigation. So when we increase soil organic matter by 1%, that soil can hold an extra 25 or 26,000 gallons of water. So increasing soil organic matter through the use of biochar and other regenerative ag means we can 3-4%, it's a quarter to a half of an acre foot of water. So it's a really great way to start helping in mitigating drought. The other is that biochar is negatively charged, or we can actually adjust its cation exchange capacity. Soil and nitrogen are both positively charged, so that's why we see nitrogen leaching and nitrogen runoff. But biochar can be negatively charged and absorb or hold that nitrogen until the plant is ready to take it up, thus sort of mitigating nitrogen leaching, nitrogen movement around the soil or out of the soil. The other thing is that it improves the mycorrhiza and the microorganism activity in the soil by essentially being that condominium. And so we see really interesting enhanced microbial life again. And when that soil is healthy, we see pathogen suppression. So those are the benefits and why biochar is interesting. But in California, biochars are interesting. And we believe we want to customize biochars for specific soil types. Well, how do we do that? In slow pyrolysis, we can adjust the heat that the biochar process generates. And at, say, 400 degrees Celsius, we can have a lower pH. We can reduce or adjust the surface area. BET is a measurement of surface area. At 700 degrees Celsius, we can have a higher pH. We can adjust its cation exchange capacity and acidic functional groups. The reason that's important is that when we look at California in terms of pH or soil organic matter, cation exchange capacity, or potash levels, we see variances all over the place. We may not want to use one biochar in the very basic west side of the San Joaquin Valley or the acidic east side of the San Joaquin Valley. That nuance is somewhat lost today, but customizable biochars for specific soil types, I think, is coming. Cation exchange capacity different around the valley, and soil organic matters are different in different areas. So this study was done by Michigan State, Iowa State in collaboration with the two. There's a bunch of great research going on at new research that's going on, especially UC Davis, UC Merced, and other institutions. Cornell is one of the big places where that research is being done. So in this regard, and in this talk, I'm sort of speaking more for Monterey Pacific than for Sitos. Monterey Pacific's been using biochar in its wine grape production, especially in the development of wine grapes, for 10 years. They published the OASIS study. So one of the great resources, and I'll cover this at the end of the talk, is the OASIS study. But the first piece of equipment that Monterey Pacific developed, its fabrication team led by Jeff Lehar, was the piece of equipment on the left where biochar and a compost blend could be injected in soil at a smaller rate, but in existing vineyard settings. And so that machine is depositing about 2 tons of biochar along with 3 tons of compost, 5 tons to the acre. right up against the root zone. I don't think they're doing any root knifing there, but it's a great way to get biochar in an existing production setting. The piece of the equipment on the right is the brand new piece of equipment that's adjustable in terms of width for orchards, so almonds, pistachio orchards. And we can do that now and get biochar into an existing production setting. The most important thing about this, though, is that we need to get biochar at depth. Biochar applied on the surface faces a couple different risks, wind, mostly flood, and the biochar can leave, and especially for climate purposes and carbon sequestration, we really want to get biochar at depth and into the root zone. At pre-plant, Monterey Pacific's fab team developed this injector. You can see it on the left from the behind and on the right from the side. This is a machine, an injector that gets biochar down to 4 feet in a pre-plant setting. And we see that that's the most effective way of biochar and compost blend being put into the vineyard setting as a pre-plant. And at pre-plant, we can get in, and this is how this works. We can get in, this would be about 10 tons of biochar with a 15-ton compost blend, 25 tons total per acre. This is an early picture of that machine. But what's nice is that plant, when it's being planted, is going down into a perfectly blended biochar, compost, and soil mix. By itself, the biochar is a bit hot. With compost, the compost tends to mitigate and buffer that hot aspect of biochar. But with this machine, we have a perfect blend of biochar compost. Another image would be here. This is actually in Steve McIntyre's estate vineyard. That machine on the right is actually a 4-foot, putting down a 4-foot shank and creating the trench or the delve. He's establishing the GPS coordinates, and then our drivers here in the injector and in the bank out wagon are following those GPS coordinates exactly. And then the plant will go right into the middle of that, again, with the GPS coordinates. So a very precise development. This really isn't being done anywhere else quite like this. Those guys are going about 4 or 5 miles an hour, so really covering some good ground. So anyway, the other way to do this is you can, we're hoping we can do this, is to create a biochar-based liquid fertilizer and ultimately fertigate with biochar. But really right now, the most used application method is a blend of biochar and compost planted to bulk. So, what are some things to watch out for in biochar application? Well, as I said, not all biochars are created equally. So biochar qualities and what's kind of good and what's bad, those nuances are really lost on folks today. But I think ultimately want to make sure that the right pH biochar goes into the right soil settings. And biochar that's full of or has a really high ash content is not going to be as effective as something that, where there's a high carbon content, low ash content biochar. Over application, we tried to over apply biochar. We have a vineyard where we put 77 tons of biochar per acre, and those vines are thriving. So, but we don't want to, we want to make sure it's sort of in the chemical word is the right time, the right place, and the right method. So think about that. And I just did want to cover briefly some of the benefits of biochar. This is from the Oasis Vineyard trial that Monterey Pacific, along with the Sonoma Ecology Center and Pacific Biochar, update every year. So it's an 8-year study, and we've had 5 harvests from that study. And you can kind of see over the control what the control is not listed, but the compost biochar and compost biochar blend. These are the performance of each of those during those years. What's interesting is 2020 was a pretty tough year that year, and the biochar compost blend more or less mitigated the losses of that year. But 21, 22, and to some degree 23, we see really interesting performance of biochar compost blend over and above the other methods, and certainly all of these are above the control. So a minimum of extra ton on the average. This was a 30%, 37% yield increase across the 5 years on this Oasis trial. Of course, not all biochars are going to generate these kinds of yield increases, and this just happens to be the Oasis trial. But Monterey Pacific in general, we see a pretty interesting yield increase biochar is most effective on sandy and degraded soils. We won't see that kind of yield increase on high clayey or very productive soils. The benefits there may be in soil aggregation, drought mitigation, for example, and not so much yield enhancement. But anyway, I did want to cover, these are resources that are available for you if you are interested in biochar. The UC A&R biochar database is a good place to start. I'm really a fan of Cornell and Dr. Debbie Aller there. There's some great YouTube videos of her giving presentations to, for example, Long Island wine grape growers. And you can find some interesting things on YouTube there. The US Biochar Initiative has a wonderful database, and so a lot of good information about biochar and its effectiveness there. International Biochar Initiative is a good one. The fun thing about the USDA and NRCS is the Code 336, or the Soil Carbon Amendment Program, is now a permanent program at NRCS, and they will pay for a biochar application. So just go to your local Farm Service Agency office in your county and ask them about Code 336. Again, the Oasis Vineyard Trial that was a co-partnership between the Sonoma Ecology Center, DWR, Monterey Pacific, and Pacific Biochar is just Google that. You can find that online. And Dovetail Partners has an interesting page with biochar and vineyards publication. So that's a nice place to start. Go there. And I'll just open up the rest of it for questions, if I may, or at least if you want to have questions at the end, I can answer them there.
Yeah, let's see. I think there was a couple questions that got answered already, and I don't see anyone's yet. So we'll see. If you do have questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A. Otherwise, thank you so much, Mayo. That was really informative and really great presentation. I want to acknowledge that it is almost 2 o'clock, a couple minutes away. So if anyone has to go right at 2, please do. But I am going to go ahead and share a little bit more about our Climate Action Toolkit for those of you that are able to stay on a little bit longer. So our Climate Action Toolkit for California wine. This is a screenshot of the toolkit. It's an online tool that has a lot of information in there. And the idea is to really be able to go in and hopefully access the information that is most helpful to you. For some people to go through the entire step-by-step process, and others to just go and kind of find the resources that are going to be helpful to you. So there's a lot of information in there, but hopefully you can find what you're looking for quickly. It does have a step-by-step process included in it. So step 1 is really all about learning the background of climate action and kind of why is it essential, going a lot deeper into some of the things that we talked about today. And then step 2 is around assessing and planning. So really assessing where are your current climate smart practices, and then how can you actually create a climate action plan to really lay out the other practices that you can implement to increase your mitigation and adaptation. And then step 3 is all about getting more information about those practices that you've identified as you wanting to look into, research more, or implement. And so that's where there's a lot of resources and links to other information. And so the assess and plan section is really kind of a big component of the toolkit. And it starts by looking at your climate smart practices, and then adaptation strategies, looking at carbon footprints. I'll talk about these all briefly, and then using that information to help you plan. So as I mentioned earlier, sustainable wine growing can really be considered climate smart. And so for those of you familiar with our California Code of Sustainable Wine Growing, there's been a number of practices within that code that have been identified as climate smart practices. And we now have a report where you can actually go in and download your self-assessment scores that pull out those climate smart practices for you to look at. Anyone who doesn't want to do a full self-assessment, we have the ability to go in there and just complete the climate smart practices to do a self-assessment and then be able to run this report more quickly. So that's in our online system. And then for the adaptation strategies, Lauren, I don't believe mentioned that we do have a summary handout of the literature review work that the California Climate Hub has done. So this is a piece of what's in that grower handout, and it really tries to summarize what's in the much more in-depth literature review. And so it's one way to really look at, okay, you know, if you're concerned around extreme heat, what are some of the adaptation strategies that you could be looking at? So again, another tool to help you really assess and plan your practices. You can also use the hotspots included in the carbon footprint studies. And so, as I mentioned, the California wine carbon footprint study can be used. It's representative of vineyards and wineries, so you can use that. There's also metrics available in our online system. And then the best way to really look at your own individual carbon footprint is to complete your own greenhouse gas inventory. International Wineries for Climate Action is a great organization that has a greenhouse gas emissions calculator available. We will be having a webinar on greenhouse gas inventories if you're interested on June 5th at 1 p.m. And we're going to get a lot more into what's involved with inventories and more background and how to use them. There's also a lot of commercial software systems as well to help you do an inventory. And then within the toolkit, it has a template for helping you create your climate action plan. And this includes example climate action goals, example practices, outcomes. You can use this template to include information around potential cost share opportunities, people responsible, et cetera. For those of you familiar with doing the action plans for certification, it's kind of a similar model, but hopefully really gets you to look at what are the potential climate smart practices you could implement and then how to help you prioritize those. As I mentioned, the implement section is really where it's getting into much more details about all of the different practices. So you can see here, the vineyard side has viticulture adaptation, soil health, drought resiliency, all of the things that Lauren was talking about as really key adaptation strategies for vineyards. And so just to dig a little deeper, you can see, in the viticulture, it does talk more about drought tolerant rootstocks and scion selections, goes into more around vineyard design, canopy management, a whole section around soil health and all of the things we talked about there, and carbon sequestration. Also, a lot more information around irrigation efficiency and drought resiliency, a whole section around energy efficiency and using renewable energy within the vineyard. So again, lots of different resources there available for you within the toolkit. We also have a couple topics that are both for vineyards and wineries that include sustainable purchasing, working with your suppliers, and also around vehicles and transportation. This is just a screenshot of one of the pages, just so again, there's kind of some background information, lots of information around terminology, and then lots of resources available to you kind of as you decide where you'd want to dig in and what areas that you're wanting to focus on. And we can share after this, but we have still a beta link that is being used now, although our link will go live probably next week. But either way, you can use that link and it'll redirect you there. But there's, again, lots of templates, case studies, fact sheets, all kinds of good resources to help you once you decide kind of what areas you'd like to focus on. As I mentioned in the very beginning, we also wanted to look around at communications around climate action. So we do have a new section of the Discover California Wines website that is live now that talks about climate action within the industry and the link to sustainability. We've done some stuff with some example message points that people can use if they want to talk about their own climate action work. And this on the right-hand side is a nice little bookmark that we created for some events that we have participated in. And that is it. So I apologize for going over. I do want to see if anyone has any questions before we close out. Let's see. I don't think so. Okay, well, you can always reach out to us at CSWA, info@sustainablewinegrowing.org. I know many of you know how to find us, but thank you all so much for your time and attention today. Thank you, Lauren and Mayo. Really appreciate you both being here today. And have a great day, everybody.